Hello, welcome. We are Alina and April. We
Hi.
are the owners of Dear Darby, and we love to give educational information. So tonight we are talking about artificial rupture of membranes.
Yes, the pros and cons, because there are pros and cons of artificially rupturing your membranes. So what are the membranes we're talking about?
So your artificial, it's essentially the breaking of the bag of waters.
Yeah.
So
The amniotic sac.
The amniotic sac. It typically happens spontaneously or naturally by the later on in pregnancy. So even though the movies tend to show that like, a woman's water breaks and then she starts screaming and is rushed to the hospital, that only happens in about 10% of women.
Yeah.
Well, I should say births, because just because that happens doesn't mean it will always happen for every birth that she has.
So typically the amniotic sac will rupture around transition in labor. So that's after 8 centimeters and beyond 10 centimeters.
And even into pushing, that bearing down will often rupture that sac spontaneously. So we're talking artificial. So that is with the help or augmentation of a care provider by taking what looks like a crochet hook and sticking it up the vaginal canal and kind of snagging that sac so that it brings the water down. The thought behind it is that it speeds up labor. Mm-hmm. So if that's the thought behind it, we personally recommend that you don't participate in that before 7 or 8 centimeters, just because when the water is broken and that sac has been
released the water,
then it makes it so there's a time clock in the time that you need to have your baby
because of introduction of bacteria, things like that.
But also infection.
Yeah, and if your baby isn't in a great position, it's hard to reposition the baby. There's umbilical cord issues that can happen, and it can increase your labor pain, according to studies.
And the intensity of the contractions. Yeah. Typically what you have is that the baby has a cushion, right? The sac is here's the baby's head, here's the sac, here's the cervix. And so as the uterus is gloving down on that baby and it's coming down, it's actually, there's a nice cushy sac between your your cervix and your baby's head. When that water releases, that baby's head comes down onto the cervix and it makes it so that things become more intense and typically more painful.
Yes. So no matter what, a couple things to think about are, if you're presented with the option to break your water or artificially rupture your membranes, just ask a few questions. Like, is this really going to speed up my labor? Why are you asking me to do this? Is
there any
alternative?
Well, alternatives, but also like, is my life in danger? Look, is the heart rate fine?
Yes, and are there any alternatives? Hospital and care providers, if you're in a hospital specifically, they like to see your labor moving along at a steady pace,
a specific time.
Yeah, and so they'll recommend to do that to keep your labor moving. But sometimes instead of moving, just repositioning, walking around, things like that will help your labor to keep going without the artificial rupture of membranes. And you can break your water if you want to, and that's totally fine.
Yeah, like assess for yourself. Once you get all the information, you ask the questions, assess for yourself. Well, the second recommendation we have is that you ask for time.
Yes.
Once you get all the information, then you say, hey, can I have some time to think about it and talk it over with my partner or my birth team or whoever you are okay with in the room. Then have all the nurses, doctors, all the care providers, everybody leave the room so that you can feel free to actually talk instead of trying to communicate with your eyes of like, do you think this is a good idea? I don't know. Do you think this is a good idea? And then you can actually talk together and assess for yourself what that looks like, how you feel about it, and if you want to go for it.
Yes. So according to research, the research, they've done extensive research on artificial rupturing of the membranes, if it induces labor or if it speeds up labor. And basically the evidence shows that it does neither of those. If you've had it done and you feel like it sped up your labor, that's awesome and perfect. But most likely when you rupture your membranes too early on in your labor, it you will have more interventions, Pitocin, C-sections.
It can facilitate a slippery slope for interventions just because, again, it puts you on that time slope, and it can give some opportunity for some issues in the baby, because there's lots of cushion and water that's surrounding your baby. And now when there's not, a lot of things are more compressed and typically tighter and harder on them, just as much as it is on you.
Yes. So now we want to talk about how the stripping of the membranes is different than the rupturing of the membranes. So the rupture is you're breaking your water to induce labor and to speed it up, most importantly, as you are laboring with your baby.
Well, you're in active labor.
In active labor, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And now stripping of your membranes is something different. It still has to do with the amniotic sac, but the stripping of the membranes is mostly used to induce labor, to get it started. And what stripping of the membranes is.
So what happens is that you've got your uterine wall and your amniotic sac. And so in a vaginal exam, so typically at your care provider, during an appointment, one of your just regular appointments, as you're close to term. So this would probably be, if not 37 weeks, close to 37 weeks or after. What they can do is, as they are checking your cervix, they can go up past the cervix and kind of separate the uterine wall from the amniotic sac, and as much as they can separate and make them.
So basically what it's doing is irritating the uterus, and then hopefully it'll start contracting
as a uterine stimulant.
So that's the hope. You may start contractions, you may not start contractions. It really depends on your cervix. That's the most important indication of you having your baby. And it is pretty painful for some women to have that stretch and sweep, or the stripping of the membranes.
Depending on how high your cervix is. So if you're presented with the option of getting your cervix or your membranes swept or stripped, ask about your cervix first.
Yeah.
If it's closed,
always ask about it.
If it's tight, if it's hard, if it's
soft, is it?
It will tell you if the sweeping or stripping will be effective, and then also how much pain it will be. Because if it's, again, higher and closed, it's going to be a lot harder for that care provider to get in and to make any movement.
Yes. So ask about your cervix. Your cervix will always tell you more about when your baby's coming than anything else. And the stripping of the membranes will not be effective if your cervix is not ready. So ask about your cervix. If you strip your membranes, just know there are pros and cons. It could rupture your membranes. 10% of women have, it's an accidental rupture of your membranes, and then you're on the time clock and your body might not be fully ready, but now you have to go into labor according to the hospital. Yeah. So these are just this is some information about artificial rupturing of the membranes.
We highly recommend that you do your own research.
Please do your own research.
Decide for yourself.
Yeah.
In the moment, get all of the information and assess yourself. Am I ready? Yeah, I want this baby out. That's fine. I'm totally fine with that. And you make the decision for you. So do your research now, and then assess yourself and decide for yourself when you're in the moment. So
you got this.
You're going to do great things. We're so excited for you.